Section 19 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Part 2. Prophylaxis and Therapeutics of Crime. Chapter 1. Penal Substitutes, Climate, Civilization, Density, Scientific Police, Photography, Identification. Subchapter 130. If crime is often really a fatal consequence of certain constitutions which are naturally predisposed to it, it is then almost irremediable, and we can no longer hope that education or imprisonment will be remedies sufficient to combat it. But we see in these cases the causes of the constant recidivism under every penal system, and what is more important, we get a hint of the proper course for a new system of criminal therapeutics to follow. It is no longer enough to repress crime. We must try to prevent it. If we cannot suppress it, we can at least ask for means to decrease the influence of the causes we have been studying upon occasional, juvenile, and partial criminals. For this purpose we must use what Ferry has so happily called penal substitutes, the idea that the legislator, recognizing and studying the causes of crime, shall seek by preventive means to neutralize them or at least decrease their effect. Thus, in the economic sphere, freedom of exchange prevents local scarcity and hence removes the fatal cause of theft and riot. The lowering of customs duties, or better still, their abolition, prevents smuggling. A more equitable distribution of taxation prevents frauds against the state. The substitution of metallic currency for the more easily imitated banknotes reduces the amount of counterfeiting. Better salaries for public officers diminish the chance of bribery and corruption, while the distribution of wood to the poor stops thefts in the forest better than a crowd of gendarmes. Broad electric-lighted streets are better than policemen to prevent theft and rape. In the political sphere, a really liberal government, like that of England, prevents anarchistic insurrections and acts of revenge, just as entirely liberty of the press prevents corruption of the government and insurrection of the governed. In the scientific sphere, autopsies tend to prevent poisoning in general, as Martin's test has checked arsenic poisoning in particular. So likewise, steamships have abolished piracy, and railroads have cut down highway robbery. In the legislative sphere, proper laws for the acknowledgement of illegitimate children, for investigating their parentage, and for identification in cases of the breach of a promise of marriage will diminish abortions, infanticides, and many homicides committed for revenge. In the same way, civil justice at a low price will prevent offences against the public order, juries of honour will prevent duels, and foundling hospitals will prevent infanticides. In the religious system, the marriage of the clergy and the abolition of pilgrimages will cause the disappearance of many sexual crimes. In the field of education, the abolition of atrocities, spectacles, and gambling would be a means of preventing brawls and crimes of violence. Subchapter 131. Climate and Race. Let us now attempt a systematic application of substitutes for punishment, following the classification of the more serious cause of crime. We certainly cannot prevent the effect of a hot climate upon crime. We ought to try to introduce those institutions most fitted to temper its effects. For example, prostitution should be regulated in such a way as to diminish sexual excesses. Baths of salt or fresh water should be made accessible to the whole population, as was the case in ancient Rome, and is now in Calabria, for nothing diminishes the exciting effect of the heat more than cold water. That we ought to make judicial punishments more swift, and hence better adapted to affect impressionable minds, avoiding, however, a pedantic uniformity that would extend the same laws to northern districts, which need different treatment, especially as to crimes against persons, and above all, sexual crimes. The promoter of the new Italian Code deplores, as a very great inconvenience, the disparity which exists in the judicial treatment of citizens of different parts of the kingdom. But he does not reflect that if this difference did not exist in the law, it would certainly exist in some much more substantial, namely, in public opinion, which interprets a homicide and Mazzara quite differently from the way in which it is interpreted at Aosta, a fact that is sure to make itself felt at the trial, An attempted rape upon a 12-year-old girl is a different thing in the South, where sexual maturity comes early from what it is in the North, and the question of the age of consent must be differently decided for different climates. But here there is necessary a careful investigation as to whether, and how far, sexual maturity is accompanied by mental maturity. We have now, in this regard, a unified law. Yet it certainly has not served to diminish the number of the crimes, but only to make the law itself powerless, an object of derision. To unify the law in reality, and not upon paper simply, it would be necessary to unify the morals, birthright, and sexual characteristics, and more than that, to unify the climate, soil, and system of agriculture. Otherwise the law would remain like the ukase which commanded the Poles to change their language. It is possible to exterminate a people, but not to take away their language, unless it is possible to change at a stroke their entire physical constitution. It proves nothing that certain countries with populations ethnically different have a uniform law. In Corsica, thanks to the juries, the French law remains a dead letter. In Switzerland, on the other hand, each canton has its own penal laws, and no inconvenience has resulted from it. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, too, has no general penal code, but a series of special laws which vary from the three kingdoms. The same situation exists in the United States, and these are the freest countries, and in England, at least, crime is on the decrease. It is not to be desired that the specialization be extended in detail to provinces and communes, for the matter is one that affects large ethnic and climatic groups. But where gypsies, for example, are numerous, it would be absurd to treat them as citizens of Paris or London would be treated, and try them before gypsy juries. Subchapter 132. Barbarism. It is impossible to extirpate barbarism all at once, but its harmful effects can be lessened by clearing the forests, those natural fortresses and malefactors, by opening new roads, and by founding towns and villages in the wilder places. This last was the course taken by Luitprandl in 734 to put an end to the brigandage that flourished in the uninhabited parts of Modena. To these measures should be coupled an energetic repression of the arrogance of the powerful and the revenge of the weak, those two fertile sources of brigandage. By a rational education, superstition and prejudice should be removed or made to serve against crime, as Garibaldi and Napoleon attempted to have them serve. Certain institutions without utility for civilized countries should be abolished. Such are the jury system, the National Guard, popular election of judges, and all secret societies, especially monastic societies, so favourable to hatred and wrongdoing. Emigration should be watched and regulated, and associations of criminals prevented or destroyed as soon as formed, through rewards offered to their individual members for information. Receivers of stolen goods and their accomplices, those natural propagators of crime, should be severely handled by the aid of an able police force. Finally, honest but weak citizens should be encouraged, or if that is not possible, terrified until, placed between fear of the criminals and fear of the law, they shall be more in awe of the latter than of the former. This is the method to which Manhurs owes the destruction of 4,000 brigands in 4 months. When crime, not of an economic, political, or religious character, but purely ethnic, flourishes under the protection of certain free institutions, such as the inviolability of domicile, the prohibition of preventative arrest, the freedom of association, jury, trial, etc., it becomes indispensable to suspend these privileges until the epidemic of crime is suppressed, as is done in the freest countries of England, America, and Portugal. It is in the interest of civilization not to allow so precious a possession as liberty to be destroyed by misuse. On this account, when brigandage, the Camorra, or the Mafia takes on a political aspect, it is necessary to pass the most severe laws to prevent the possibility of their influencing the elections. The elector who is even merely suspected of participation in these associations ought to lose all political rights, and persons arrested for such participation should be sent to distant localities exempt from endemic criminality, or better, transported to the islands. The political tribunate, of which we shall speak later, should give particular attention to the carrying out of these measures. Finally, a restriction of the pardoning power, especially with reference to organized criminals, would be useful, and in any case it ought not to be possible for them to return to the district which is their natural field of action. Subchapter 133. Civilization. The harmful effects of great aggregations of population, which are those of civilization pushed to the limit, can be prevented by bringing into play new preventives to counteract the new weapons placed in the hands of crime. The attempt may be made to prevent the evil effects of the great centres by transporting to the smaller cities institutions that draw numbers of persons to places already overcrowded, such as universities, academies, scientific laboratories, military colleges, etc. These great masses of people cannot be suddenly dispersed, but they can be clarified, and the emigration of the unemployed encouraged by furnishing free transportation if necessary. If the population increases more than its food supply, the practice of neo-Malthusianism must be energetically disseminated. A certain Englishman, a citizen, that is to say, of the country which is the most scrupulous about personal liberty, proposes that those houses which criminals make their habitual resort should be closely watched and if necessary suppressed, and that these elements of the population shall not be able to meet, and hence may become harmless. He proposes further to visit with severe penalties what he calls the capitalists of crime, the receivers of stolen goods, who are almost always go unpunished. In order to prevent the increase of crime through immigration, a sort of selection should be practiced, as is to some extent done in the United States. Only those should be accepted as immigrants who are sound and respectable and have some means of manual skill. It is by virtue of such a selection as this, together with judicial investigations, that France has been able in recent years to purify this stream of immigration and obtain a decrease in crime. Subchapter 134. Modern Police System. We have hitherto carried on our police system very much as war was made in the heroic ages, when the cleverness or muscular strength of single individuals alone decided the victory. We have very able police officers, able as Ulysses and Achilles were in their battles, but we have no mob, no one corresponding to a general staff officer to make use of his campaigns against crime of the resources offered to him by study of statistics, criminal anthropology, etc., which would multiply his personal talent by the enormous forces placed at his disposal by science. The telegraph, for example, applied to railroad lines, the railroad itself, the telephone, these are instruments placed in our hands to be used against the new tools that civilization has furnished to crime. We may add to these a well-arranged collection of photographs of criminals. In America, the companies that insure against burglary have introduced electric burglar alarms. In various American cities, likewise, the police are furnished with signal boxes, so that in case of necessity, a policeman can summon assistance without leaving his beat. Guillard proposes the association of all nations for the arrest of criminals, with uniform extradition treaties and a sort of international police, who shall exchange photographs of criminals and give notice of those who are going to foreign countries, whether voluntarily or because deported, with the exception of those rare cases where the criminal has learned to support himself by trade. For this purpose an international criminal register and international bureau of information would be necessary. In England there has been introduced the corps of detectives, and in Austria the corresponding organization of veterans, who form the aggressive force in the front line against crime. These take up the search for the criminal and push it to the end, making use of all the means at their disposal, railroad, telegraph, press, but especially a knowledge of the features, and what is not so easily changed, the look of criminals, and the collection of photographs of which I have spoken. Subchapter 135. Methods of Identification. If a good commissary in Italy wants to put his hands upon the unknown author of some crime, he has recourse to his memory, to photographs, and to the clumsy criminal register instituted a few years ago. But in a kingdom as large as Italy, with such rapid means of communication, thousands of individuals escape observation. The best memory would not be much help. Delinquents easily succeed in eluding the police by changing their names, or arrested, give them a false idea of their antecedents by taking the name of some respectable person. From this one sees how necessary it is to have means of identifying accused persons with scientific accuracy, and of all the systems proposed for this purpose, that of Bertillon is undoubtedly the best. At the prefecture of the Paris police, to which he was attached, there were preserved several thousand photographs of delinquents, but it became increasingly difficult to make use of them as the number of delinquents increased. For this reason, Bertillon proposed to classify criminals according to the measurements of certain parts of the body which could be taken as invariable. These are the height, the length and breadth of the head, the length of the middle finger of the left hand, the length of the left foot, and the length of the circumference of the left forearm. Supposing the records to be divided up into series on the basis of these measurements, it is evident that it would be necessary in identifying a criminal only to examine the photographs of a single series, or at most to add the series on each side, as the error in measurement could only be very small. This system of Bertillon's is based upon the fact that when the human body has reached its complete development, it remains almost invariable, and that it is impossible to find two individuals completely alike. By use of this method, Bertillon obtained 3,017 identifications between 1883 and 1890. This was the first trial of Bertillonage. After a time it was perceived that it was possible to make the identifications by the measurements alone, without the aid of photographs. Thus far, the identification had an essentially judicial character. It served to guarantee to the magistrate the identity and the antecedents of the individual undergoing trial. But a new advance allowed the utilization of this method by the police. In furnishing them with the data necessary to recognize a delinquent still at liberty and concealed under a false name, this Bertillon obtained with speaking photographs, that is, photographs accompanied by a minute description of the individual and his particular physical characteristics. With this same object, the author has constructed an improved tachyanthropometer, a contrivance by which the necessary measurements of the body and skull may be quickly made, and which also permits the lateral, transverse, and horizontal curves of the skull to be taken and recorded automatically by means of an electric pen. This latter system has the great advantage that the procedure is purely mechanical, and that the sources of error are much less numerous than in the regular Bertillon system. And while in the millimetric measurements the only means of verifying their accuracy is to repeat them where the cranial outlines are taken, their precision can be tested by their direct superposition upon the head of the subject. It should not be forgotten that in the ordinary system the points of difference between individuals are very limited, while in the new system they are very numerous. Subchapter 136. The Press. The police must also avail itself systematically of the services of the press, for the press is an instrument of civilization as well as of crime, and can't be neither suppressed nor restricted without injury to true freedom. The thing to be done, obviously, is to utilize it for the protection of society. In Switzerland, the government authority has a sort of handbook containing the photographs and biographies of the principal Swiss criminals. In Germany, it is a custom to insert in the more popular newspapers the description of the criminals most sought for, their photographs, and the amount of the reward promised for their apprehension. At Mainz, there is a newspaper published in 3 languages, French, German, and English, Moniteur International de Police Criminelle, Internationals Criminal Police Bellet, International Criminal Police Times, which is published weekly by the Police Consular and contains the portraits and marks of the criminal sort. At Cairo in Egypt, there is published every Thursday a newspaper in Arabic, Fakwai or Bubis, or Police News, edited by the Bureau of Police, which contains the portraits of the homicides and counterfeit arrests, with notes of their crimes and minute descriptions. Thus the press, through their very publicity, which has been hitherto a source of blackmail, fraud, and libel, have become a means of social defense. Subchapter 137. Plethysmography. But there is something better in prospect. We have abolished torture, and we may congratulate ourselves upon it. But though this brutal means of investigation more often deceived than gave light, it is still an evil that nothing better has arisen to take the place left empty by its abolition. Now the knowledge of biological anomalies, anesthesia, analgesia, left-handedness, abnormal field of vision, and of psychological anomalies, the cruelty, vanity, and improvidence of criminals, may help to fill up the gap. So also other data like obscene and vindictive tattooing, etc. Despine has already suggested the arrest of habitual criminals when they boast that they are going to commit a crime, knowing that in these cases the act follows close upon the word. We have already, in the first volume of my on criminal, seen how the plethysmograph of Mosso was able, without affecting the health and without any pain, to penetrate in the most secret recesses of the mind of the criminal. I have myself made use of this instrument in a complicated case, proving that a certain well-known criminal was not guilty of the crime with which he was accused, but was guilty of a theft, at first connected with him by this test alone, but later brought home to him by judicial investigation. End of section 19.